Montana Territory, 1878. A cruel wind pushed through the valley, swirling dust devils across the parched main street of Whitetail Creek. Faith Northcott stood alone outside the general store, clutching a small velvet pouch that contained her mother's wedding ring, her final possession of value. At 22, with her honey-blonde hair tied back in a simple ribbon and her once fine blue dress now mended in a dozen places, she looked both out of place and somehow perfectly at home in this frontier outpost. The weight of her circumstances pressed down on her slender shoulders, yet her posture remained straight, defiant against the crushing burden of recent events. Faith believed that trust was a luxury she could no longer afford. The frontier had taken everything from her, first her parents to fever, then her inheritance to a swindler, and finally her modest homestead to fire. The harsh lessons of the West had carved themselves into her heart. Rely on no one, expect the worst, and never, ever believe in salvation. She wanted only enough money for a stagecoach ticket east, back to distant relatives who might take her in. What she truly needed, though she would have denied it fiercely, was to discover that not all men were like those who had stripped away her life piece by piece. Inside the general store, Bryce Calloway adjusted his worn Stetson and wiped trail dust from his weather-tanned face. At 25, he'd already lived several lifetimes, cattle driver, ranch hand, and now a man with modest savings looking to put down roots. His clean-shaven face and clear blue eyes gave him a younger appearance than most cowboys his age, the hard edges of frontier life not yet fully embedded in his features. He'd come to Montana to purchase supplies for the small parcel of land he'd finally managed to claim, driven by a belief that a man had to build his future alone, with his own two hands. "Reckon I'll take 20 pounds of flour, 10 of coffee, and those nails," he told the shopkeeper, counting out coins from a leather pouch. The storekeeper nodded toward the window. "Might want to hurry, son. Looks like another dust storm's brewing." Bryce followed his gaze, but it wasn't the distant brown cloud that caught his eye. It was the young woman standing outside, shoulders squared despite the obvious weight of desperation surrounding her. Faith pushed open the door, the little bell above jangling to announce her arrival. She'd rehearsed her speech carefully, determined to maintain dignity despite the shameful nature of her errand. "Mr. Simmons," she addressed the storekeeper with forced composure, "I've come to inquire if you might purchase this." She placed the velvet pouch on the counter, opening it to reveal a delicate gold ring with a small pearl. "It was my mother's." The storekeeper frowned, picking up the ring and turning it in the light. "Not much call for jewelry out here, Miss Northcott. I could give you $2. The color drained from Faith's face. $2. "But sir, this ring is worth at least." "It's worth what someone's willing to pay," Simmons interrupted, not unkindly, "and out here that ain't much." Bryce watched from nearby, his purchases momentarily forgotten. Something in the woman's desperate dignity stirred him. He'd seen proud people reduced to selling their treasures before, but there was something particularly poignant about this woman's situation. "If you'll excuse me," Faith said, reaching for the ring with trembling fingers, "I'll try elsewhere." "There ain't elsewhere in Whitetail Creek, miss," Simmons said, "not for things like this." Bryce stepped forward before he could think better of it. "Begging your pardon, ma'am, but that ring looks mighty fine. Family heirloom." Faith turned, startled by the young cowboy's intervention. His eyes were kind, but she'd learned to distrust kindness most of all. "My mother's wedding ring," she said stiffly, "and yes, it's the last thing of value I possess." Something in her phrasing caught Bryce's attention. The last thing, who took everything else? The directness of his question caught Faith off guard. For weeks, no one had asked, no one had seemed to care enough to inquire about the series of misfortunes that had left her destitute. "A sequence of men, each more dishonorable than the last," she said, surprising herself with her candor. "My father's business partner claimed most of our estate through forged papers after my parents died. The banker foreclosed on our homestead despite my having the payment money in hand. And 3 nights ago, a man I unwisely trusted set fire to my cabin and disappeared with my horses and savings." Bryce's jaw tightened, and the law's done nothing. Faith laughed bitterly. "The sheriff suggested I find a husband before winter comes." A silence fell over the store. Even Simmons had the decency to look uncomfortable. "I don't need your pity," Faith continued, straightening her shoulders. I merely need fair value for this ring so I might purchase passage east. Bryce studied her for a long moment. Mr. Simmons, I'll take my supplies now, and add whatever the lady needs for a week's provisions. Faith's eyes flashed. I don't accept charity, sir. It's not charity, Bryce replied evenly. It's a loan, and in return you'll tell me the names of these men who have wronged you. And what would you do with such information? She challenged. A slow smile spread across his face, not one of amusement but of determination. Let's just say I've some experience setting things right, and I've got time before winter sets in. That evening, as the wind howled outside the town's small boarding house, Faith found herself seated across from Bryce Calloway in the empty dining room, her mother's ring still safely in her possession and a bowl of hot stew before her. Despite her better judgment, she'd accepted his offer of a meal. You still haven't explained why you're helping me, Faith said, pushing her spoon through the thick stew. What do you gain from this arrangement? Bryce considered her question as he broke a piece of bread. My pa taught me that a man's worth is measured by what he does when nobody's watching. Nobody's watching now, Miss Northcott, and I can't in good conscience let those men get away with what they've done. Justice is rare in these territories, she said softly. Maybe so, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't seek it. He leaned forward. Start from the beginning, tell me everything. Faith hesitated, then began her story. She told him of her parents' death from fever last winter, of the arrival of her father's partner, Edwin Markham, with documents claiming ownership of their merchant business in Helena. She described the hastily arranged auction of their belongings, leaving her with barely enough to secure a small homestead near Whitetail Creek. The banker, Prescott, seemed kind at first, she continued, her voice growing harder. Offered me fair terms for the mortgage, but when I brought my payment last month, he claimed I was a week late and had already begun foreclosure proceedings. Bryce listened intently, occasionally asking questions about dates and details. His expression remained calm, but Faith noted how his hands tightened around his coffee cup at certain parts of her story. And the man who burned your cabin? He asked, Faith's cheeks flushed with shame. James Harker. He presented himself as a horse trader passing through, offered to help with repairs to my roof. She faltered, I was lonely, foolish. I allowed him to stay for supper several evenings. He must have discovered where I kept my savings. I woke to flames and barely escaped with my life. He was gone, along with my 2 horses and everything of value. When was this? 3 nights ago. Bryce nodded slowly. Horse thief won't have gotten far, not if he's selling stolen stock. The other 2 might be more complicated. Faith shook her head. You speak as though you can actually do something about all this. You're one man against established businessmen and criminals. Sometimes one man is all it takes, especially when he's got right on his side. He smiled slightly. Besides, I'm not without resources or friends. Why would you help a stranger? The question had been burning inside her since he'd first intervened. Bryce's expression grew serious. 3 years back, I had everything stolen from me too, cattle I was driving north, my savings, even my good name for a spell. A stranger helped me then, asked nothing in return except that I do the same for someone else someday. He shrugged. Reckon today's that day. Faith wanted to believe him, but her recent experiences had left deep scars. And if you retrieve any of my property, what will you expect as payment? His eyes met hers steadily. Nothing you're not willing to give, Miss Northcott, my word on that. Something in his steady gaze made Faith believe him, despite all her hard-learned caution. For the first time in months, she felt the faintest flicker of hope. Get some rest, Bryce said, rising from the table. Tomorrow, I'll send some telegrams and see about tracking down a horse thief. Dawn broke cold and clear over Whitetail Creek. Faith woke to a knock at her door and found a folded note that had been slipped underneath. Bryce's handwriting was surprisingly neat. Gone to follow leads, back by nightfall, stay in town, BC. The day passed slowly. Faith busied herself mending her dress and washing her spare clothes in the boarding house laundry. The normalcy of these tasks felt strangely comforting after weeks of crisis. By late afternoon, she found herself watching the road from the boarding house window, searching for signs of Bryce's return. He rode in as the sun was setting, his horse moving at an easy lope. Faith watched him dismount outside the livery stable, noting how he moved with the fluid grace of a man accustomed to long hours in the saddle. He spoke briefly with the stableman, then headed toward the boarding house. She met him in the small parlor, anxiety tightening her chest. "Did you find anything?" Bryce removed his hat. "I did. Harker tried to sell your horses at a ranch 20 miles south. The owner got suspicious when Harker couldn't explain the brand, turned him away but remembered which direction he headed. And I found his trail. He's joined up with 2 other men heading toward the territorial border, but they're moving slow, camping along the way." His eyes held hers. "I can catch up to them, but I'd need to leave at first light." Faith frowned. "You make it sound as though you'd go alone. Shouldn't you inform the sheriff?" A wry smile crossed Bryce's face. Sheriff Tanner's got his hands full with Saturday night coming. Besides, these men might cross into Idaho territory before the law can organize a proper posse. "It sounds dangerous," Faith said softly. "Most worthwhile things are," he replied. "The question is, do you trust me to act on your behalf?" Faith studied him carefully. Everything she'd learned told her not to trust this man, or any man, yet something about Bryce Calloway's straightforward manner and steady gaze made her want to believe in him. "If you recover my property, what would you want in return?" she asked again. "Your help," he answered simply. "I've got land southeast of here, good land, but it needs work. I could use someone with a sharp mind to help me get established properly. You're offering me employment." He nodded. "Fair wages, your own cabin once I can build it. Reckon we both could benefit from the arrangement." Faith considered his offer. She'd been ready to flee east, to throw herself on the mercy of distant relatives. But the thought of working, of building something new rather than retreating in defeat, held unexpected appeal. "I accept," she said finally, "but be careful. Harker is not a man to be underestimated." Bryce smiled. "Neither am I, Miss Northcott." Before dawn the next morning, Faith stood on the boarding house porch watching Bryce make final adjustments to his saddle. He worked with practiced efficiency, checking his rifle and securing provisions. "I've left money with Mrs. Jenkins for your room and board," he told her. "Should be back within 3 days, one way or another." "What if you don't return?" Faith asked, voicing the fear that had kept her awake much of the night. Bryce paused, then reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a folded document. "This is the deed to my land. If I'm not back in a week, it's yours. There's enough money in my bank account in Helena to get you started." Faith stared at the paper, then back at him. "Why would you do that? You hardly know me." "I'm a fair judge of character," he said simply, "and I believe in having contingency plans." He tucked the deed back into his pocket. "But I plan on returning, so it won't come to that." He mounted his horse with fluid grace, tipped his hat, and rode out of Whitetail Creek as the first rays of sun broke over the eastern hills. The next 3 days were the longest of Faith's life. She helped Mrs. Jenkins at the boarding house to keep busy, cleaned and repaired her clothing, and walked the length of the small town a dozen times each day. By the evening of the 3rd day, with no word from Bryce, she found herself fighting back tears of disappointment. She'd allowed herself to hope again, and it seemed that hope would once more be crushed. On the morning of the 4th day, Faith was helping Mrs. Jenkins hang laundry when the older woman suddenly froze, staring down the main street. "Well, I'll be," Mrs. Jenkins breathed. Faith turned to see Bryce riding into town, leading 2 familiar horses behind him, her horses. Tied across the back of one was a man, his hands bound behind him. Her heart hammering, Faith ran down the street, heedless of the curious stares from townspeople. Bryce dismounted as she approached, his face bruised and a torn sleeve showing a bandaged arm beneath. "You're hurt," she gasped. "Nothing serious," he assured her, "but I brought back what's yours." Sheriff Tanner emerged from his office, eyeing the bound man with interest. "What's all this, Calloway?" "Horse thief and arsonist," Bryce replied. "Caught him and his partners at their camp near the Idaho line. The others didn't surrender as peacefully." The sheriff untied Harker and dragged him, cursing, toward the jailhouse. "I'll need statements from both of you," he called over his shoulder. Faith stood trembling, staring at her recovered horses. "My savings?" she asked quietly. Bryce reached into his saddlebag and withdrew a small pouch, most of it. He'd already spent some in the saloons along the way. She took the pouch, feeling its reassuring weight. I can't believe you actually did this. Said I would, didn't I? His smile was tired but genuine, and that's just the beginning. Got information from Harker about your banker friend, Prescott. Seems they had an arrangement. Prescott would identify vulnerable homesteaders and Harker would help relieve them of their property. They were working together. Faith felt sick at the revelation. Yes, ma'am, and I reckon when we present that evidence to the circuit judge next week, Mr. Prescott will find himself in considerable trouble. Bryce winced as he shifted his wounded arm. You need that properly tended, Faith said firmly. Come, Mrs. Jenkins has medicinal supplies. As she cleaned and rebandaged his wound, a bullet grazed that could have been far worse, Faith found herself studying Bryce's face. Beneath the trail dust and fatigue was a man unlike any she'd encountered before, a man whose actions matched his words. Why did you really help me? She asked softly, the truth this time. Bryce met her gaze. Because from the moment I saw you standing there, refusing to break despite everything, I recognized something familiar. The same thing I see in the mirror sometimes, someone who's been knocked down by life but keeps getting up anyway. His honest answer touched something deep within Faith. For the first time since her parents' death, she felt truly seen. The following weeks brought changes Faith could scarcely have imagined. With Harker's testimony, banker Prescott was arrested and the foreclosure on Faith's homestead was reversed. Though the cabin was burned beyond repair, the land itself remained valuable. More surprising was the information Bryce uncovered about Edwin Markham, her father's duplicitous business partner. Through careful investigation and several telegrams to his contacts in Helena, Bryce discovered that Markham had indeed forged documents to claim ownership of the Northcott business. The territorial court has issued a warrant for his arrest, Bryce told Faith as they rode together toward his land southeast of Whitetail Creek, and they've frozen his assets pending trial. You may yet recover at least part of your inheritance. Faith absorbed this news in wonder. I never thought I'd see justice done. Justice takes work, Bryce replied, and sometimes it takes longer than we'd like. But that doesn't mean we should stop pursuing it. They crested a hill and below them spread a verdant valley, bisected by a clear, rushing stream. Stands of pine provided natural windbreaks and the meadows were thick with summer grass. This is yours? Faith asked, taking in the beautiful landscape. Ours, in a manner of speaking, Bryce said. You agreed to help me establish it, remember, and I keep my agreements. Over the next months, Faith discovered a strength in herself she hadn't known existed. She helped Bryce build a proper cabin before winter set in, learned to manage cattle, and kept meticulous records of their expenses and profits. Her small cabin, constructed a respectful distance from Bryce's, became a home filled with books and small comforts. As autumn painted the surrounding hills in gold and crimson, Faith found herself watching Bryce with growing admiration. He worked from dawn until dusk, always finding time to teach her the skills she needed to thrive in this frontier life. His patience seemed endless, his integrity unwavering. For his part, Bryce discovered in Faith a resilience and intelligence that impressed him daily. She approached every challenge with determination, never complaining about the hard work or isolation. Her quick mind often saw solutions to problems that had eluded him, and her growing confidence was a joy to witness. One crisp October evening, as they sat by the fire after a successful day of preparing for winter, Bryce cleared his throat awkwardly. Been meaning to ask you something, Miss Northcott. Faith looked up from her mending, noting the unusual formality in his address. Yes. You've received word that Markham's been arrested, and the court's ruled in your favor regarding your father's business assets. You'll have means of your own soon, he stared into the fire. I was wondering if you planned to return east after all. The question caught Faith by surprise. She hadn't thought about leaving in weeks, having found unexpected contentment in this new life. I have no desire to leave, she said honestly, unless you feel I've fulfilled our agreement and my presence is no longer needed. Bryce looked up quickly. No, that is, I'd like you to stay. I've grown accustomed to your company. A warmth that had nothing to do with the fire spread through Faith's chest. Then I shall stay, she said softly. I've grown accustomed to your company as well. Something shifted between them that evening, a quiet acknowledgement of feelings that had been growing steadily through shared work and mutual respect. As winter descended upon the valley bringing snow and bitter cold, Faith and Bryce fell into comfortable routines. Evenings were spent in one cabin or the other, sharing meals and conversation. Faith read aloud from novels while Bryce carved intricate wooden figures by the firelight. They discussed dreams for the ranch's future, debated politics, and gradually shared the stories of their lives before they'd met. On Christmas Eve, Bryce arrived at Faith's cabin with an armful of pine boughs and berries. "Thought we might make it festive," he explained, a touch of color in his cheeks that wasn't entirely from the cold. Together they decorated her small home, hanging the greenery and placing candles in the windows. Faith prepared a special dinner from carefully hoarded supplies, and Bryce contributed a bottle of wine he'd been saving for the occasion. After dinner, as they sat before the fire, Bryce reached into his pocket. "I have something for you, a Christmas gift." "But I have nothing for you," Faith protested, embarrassed. "You've given me more than you realize," he said seriously, placing a small package wrapped in brown paper in her hands. "Go on, open it." Faith carefully unwrapped the package to reveal a small wooden box, beautifully carved with intricate flowers and vines. Opening it, she gasped at the sight of a delicate silver locket. "It was my mother's," Bryce explained. "One of the few things I have from her. I want you to have it." Tears pricked Faith's eyes as she touched the lovely piece. "I couldn't possibly." "Please," Bryce interrupted gently. "It would honor me to see it worn by a woman of similar strength and grace." With trembling fingers, Faith opened the locket to find it empty. "There are no pictures." "I thought perhaps someday we might find ones that matter to you," Bryce said, then hesitated before continuing. "To us, perhaps." The meaning behind his words was unmistakable. Faith looked up to find him watching her intently, vulnerability plain in his expression. "Bryce," she whispered, "are you saying?" "I'm saying that these months with you have been the happiest of my life," he said, his voice low and earnest. "I'm saying that I've come to care for you in ways that go far beyond our business arrangement. I'm saying that I love you, Faith Northcott, and if you could find it in your heart to consider a more permanent partnership." Faith didn't let him finish. The walls she'd built around her heart crumbled completely as she leaned forward and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was gentle at first, then deepened with months of unspoken longing. When they finally parted, Bryce looked dazed. "I take it that's not a rejection." Faith laughed, joy bubbling up inside her. "Far from it. I love you too, Bryce Calloway. I have for longer than I've been willing to admit, even to myself." His smile was radiant as he took her hands in his. "I know it's not conventional, a woman of property considering marriage to a simple rancher." "A man who restored my faith in humanity," she corrected him. "A man who showed me that trust and love aren't weaknesses but the greatest strengths we possess." She squeezed his hands. "And yes, I will marry you." Spring came to the valley in a riot of wildflowers and new growth. The ranch, now officially christened North Star Ranch, a combination of their names, was thriving under their joint management. With Faith's recovered inheritance, they had expanded their cattle herd and hired 2 reliable hands to help with the increasing workload. On a perfect May morning, with the mountains still capped in snow but the valley lush with new life, Faith Northcott became Faith Calloway in a small ceremony attended by their closest friends and neighbors. She wore a new dress of pale blue silk, and around her neck hung Bryce's mother's locket, now containing miniature portraits of both of them. The circuit preacher pronounced them husband and wife beneath an arch of flowering branches, and as Bryce kissed his bride, cheers erupted from the assembled guests. Later, as twilight settled over their celebration and neighbors began the journey home, Bryce led Faith to a rise overlooking their property. "I have one more surprise," he said, pointing toward a stand of pines where the land dipped toward the creek. "I've been working on it when you were in town or occupied with the ledgers." Faith gasped as she made out the frame of a new house rising among the trees, larger than their cabins, with a wide porch and multiple rooms visible even at this distance. "Our home," Bryce said softly, "large enough for a family if we're so blessed, built on land we both love with room to grow and change as we do." Faith turned to her husband, her eyes bright with tears of happiness. From the moment I stood outside that general store preparing to sell my mother's ring, I never imagined life could bring me here, to this place, to you. Sometimes the frontier takes everything, Bryce acknowledged, drawing her close. But sometimes, if we're brave enough to keep our hearts open, it gives back more than we ever dreamed possible. As the last light faded from the sky and the first stars appeared above their land, Faith and Bryce Calloway stood together, no longer alone in a harsh world but partners in all things, their shared strength more than enough to face whatever challenges the frontier might bring. In the years that followed, the North Star Ranch became known throughout the territory as a place of prosperity and welcome. Travelers spoke of the handsome young rancher and his beautiful wife who had built something remarkable from the ashes of loss. Few knew the full story of how they had found each other, how a desperate young woman's attempt to sell her last possession had led to justice, healing, and a love strong enough to weather any storm the frontier might bring. And Faith's mother's wedding ring, she never did sell it. Instead, it rested safely in the carved wooden box Bryce had given her, a reminder that sometimes holding on to hope, to dignity, and to the belief that good people still existed in the world was the wisest choice of all.